Hi, everybody. I figured we weren't going to have very many people here at all, but it's nice to see a full tent. So my name is Heather Retberg. I'm a farmer in Penobscot at a farm called Quills End Farm. We're a grass-based farm. We raise laying hens and broilers and pigs in the woods and dairy cows and children who are trying to sneak out because they're free-range children, and there are no fences here at the Common Ground Fair. I got involved with the work of food sovereignty before I knew that that's what it was called, because of some interactions on our farm, and we'll get more into that later, but just a little bit to let you know who I am and where we're coming from. And Bonnie Preston, I'll let introduce herself. She is a customer of ours, and that's how great collaborations often start, over food on farms with people who care about food and farms. So that's how this all began in Maine.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Preston. As Heather said, I'm an eater and a customer of theirs. And my father grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. He didn't want to be a farmer. At the time I was glad, and later I was a little not as glad. But I grew up a typical suburban life in Southern California. And talk about 1980. I was living in Maryland by then. You know, I went to work and there was a grocery store right on my way home, and I just stop and buy my groceries and go on home and that sort of thing. And then Earl Butz entered the scene. And if you haven't read Jane Smiley's book, Moo, you really should. There is a pig who's part of an experiment at a land-grant university named Earl Butz. And that's when I started more awareness about what was going on in farming then, and I started getting really concerned about it. In 1997, I joined the National Council for the Alliance for Democracy, and one of the council members was Al Krebs. Has anybody here heard of Al Krebs? He was an independent journalist. He died in 2007. Our issue of Justice Rising, which you can pick up later, is dedicated to him. He wrote all about agribiz, and he published something called the Agribiz Examiner, and I read that religiously. Every week it came out, and it was, you know, shocking and horrible. and so that's where I was really steeped in that. I moved to Maine, tried shopping at the farmer's market, and the one in Blue Hill had very few people at the time. But then I started going to farms and stuff, and then one day I went to Heather's farm, and I found out what she was doing. I was asking if she could sell chicken, and she said, no, we can't sell chicken this year. So, but when I found out what Heather was doing, and I had been involved with local ordinances other places, I just said, I'm in. What do I need to do? And so when you start this work, it kind of takes over your life. So this is all I do anymore. So back to Heather.
So just to give you sort of a broad overview of what we want to do, we want to just lay out what are the principles of food sovereignty that what we've begun in Maine ties into internationally, because it turns out that there are a lot of farmers in other countries and other continents that are facing a lot of the same pressures that we're facing. And they've come up with a lot of the same solutions. And so Bonnie wanted to start off by reading some of those principles. After that, then we will go more into how food sovereignty started here in Maine. A part called Fantasy Civics versus Political Reality, what we found when we engaged. Some of the laws that enable us to do what we're doing in Maine that make it a very unique and a wonderful place to grow this work. A brief discussion on why not just let the state level take care of this for us. And then some basics about, if you're interested in pursuing this in your own town or in your city where you live, how to go about that. And then we do have an informational packet and issue of a magazine called Justice Rising that is dedicated to communities holding on to their local food traditions and democracy. And so we want to give that to all of you. Have any of you heard of horizontal policy diffusion? So how about vertical policy integration? So those are terms. Along the way, Bonnie and I have had the opportunity to learn a lot more about what we actually are doing. And you might think of horizontal policy diffusion as grassroots policy work, so that it's spreading, in this case, from town to town, from people to people. And a vertical policy integration, then we're talking more about how, if we got together as a group, would we say, we want the state or the federal government, we want to integrate this policy vertically, straight up. So what we've been doing is engaging across. So more like a sort of a patchwork quilt is how we think of it, that grows stronger as you patch the pieces together and blankets a whole big area. And we just think that's a really strong way to go forward, instead of throwing pebbles at big fortresses of governmental institutions. All right, so I think Bonnie is going to start with the principles of food sovereignty.
Okay, there are 7 principles of food sovereignty. La Via Campesina, which kind of started this whole, it started the formal movement. And I want you to keep these in mind, because I'm going to give you an example of food sovereignty application in Ethiopia, and think about where they might fit in here. Principle 1, I'm just going to give the highlight, but you'll have in the handout packet, you'll have an exposition on all of this. Food is a basic human right. 2 is agrarian reform. 3 is protecting natural resources. 4 is reorganizing food trade. Another question, how many of you know about the TPP? Yeah, more. Yeah. 5 is ending the globalization of hunger. Hungry people that's not a natural feature of a country or a continent. People are kept hungry by our food policies, and we really need to end all of that. 6 is social peace, and 7 is democratic control. So Heather came across an article. The winner of the 2016 Food Sovereignty Prize is from Ethiopia. I don't know how to pronounce his name for sure, but it is something like Yannis Yeimer. And he wrote 5 things. 1 was beware of corporate narratives. 2 is to fight systems, not people. 3, see food as an expression of freedom. 4 is know your history. And 5, ask people, what did you eat for breakfast? How many people in this country would say Kellogg's cereal? Okay? So what did you eat for breakfast? A good way to start a conversation with people. So as Heather said, we didn't go into this from the knowledge of food sovereignty and say, oh, we need to do this in Maine. This whole process has really been a journey, and we realized at some point, oh yeah, we do fit into the food sovereignty category. That's what we are working on the global basis. The National Family Farm Coalition has a great quote on achieving food sovereignty. And this is a quote: local democratic control of food through policy that promotes food as a basic human right, right from the 7 principles, agrarian reform, natural resource protection, food as nutrition first and as a commodity second. The end of corporatized food supply, democratic control of our food resources. All people have the right to local, fresh, healthy, affordable food. The fight for food sovereignty is international and will continue until it is fully realized. So by the time you grow up, it should be fully realized.
So part of our work in Maine, starting at the local level, also has led to legislators supporting what we're doing at the state level. Last year, the biggest effort so far at the state level was a resolution for a bill that would amend the Constitution of the state of Maine to ensure a right to food and a right to foods of our choosing from sources that we choose. That effort was ultimately not successful, but did gain a 2/3 majority in the House, which is what it needed, and then it needed a 2/3 supermajority also in the Senate. Then it would have come out to us to vote on, which is what we really loved about it, because at the heart of food sovereignty is that people decide. We're really asking fundamental questions about who's making the decisions about the foods that are in the supermarket or the foods that we have access to, and understanding that those decisions are often made very far away from us is the beginning of understanding that we need to engage in the processes of decision making so that we can have access to the foods that we want to eat or that we want to raise on our farms in a way that takes care of the land, in a way that we think is responsible and healthy for the soil and for the water. So when we went to the state level, part of our work there was really learning more about how do amendments get made to the Constitution in the state. And there was a food lawyer. There aren't very many lawyers who just deal with food, but there was a food lawyer who had a really wonderful thing to say about this. And he said, at some point, the way that our United States Constitution was framed, the constitutional authority of the government to determine the food that can lawfully be marketed and the constitutional right of the individual to personal freedom and control over his own destiny will at some juncture inevitably conflict. So at some point, this realm of safety and the realm of who gets to determine my own bodily health are going to conflict. And what our contention was to the legislature and to our towns has been is we're at that point right now. Those points are meeting, and what are we going to do about it? How do we go forward? When this all first started, it started over poultry. Took us to the legislature. We testified at a public hearing. It was the first time I ever spoke in public, and I was so nervous I threw up beforehand. And I was so grateful because I thought that was the only time I was ever going to have to speak in public, and we were going to make this one testimony and get what we needed from the legislature, and they would be very responsive. And that was 6 years ago, and we've definitely had some successes along the way, and we've talked to lots and lots of people since then. But another sort of fundamental question that came up is, what do we do when the legislators don't represent? The poultry hearings, the very first ones, were held the week of Christmas. And we didn't really think anybody was going to care to come and talk about slaughtering chickens during Christmas week. I certainly wouldn't have made that my first choice. But 50 people came, which for a public hearing on a bill of poultry slaughter is a lot of people. And by and large, people were testifying that the rules that this Department of Agriculture was going to make weren't going to make sense for Maine agriculture and for people that wanted to eat from Maine farms. And at that point, there was a great willingness, and there still is, among the legislators to do what farmers and what eaters need, and they were very responsive. But the Department of Agriculture officials came in and said, "You really can't do that, because if you do, you're going to threaten funding that we get from the USDA for our meat inspection program. And so you have to write the rules in this other way. You have to require facilities beyond the scale of what these farms can do. And that's just how it has to be." And so at that point, we realized, like, we had this idea of how democracy worked that wasn't happening. And we'll get more into that later, too. But that moment was, for us, that conflict juncture. Like, all of a sudden we realized that they were telling us they couldn't do, whether or not they wanted to, they couldn't do what the people were asking them to do. And that wasn't a representative democracy by the way that I had learned about it in school. And it really propelled us forward. So our farm story that led to this happening, I keep looking at Rob in the back. I'm just going to give you a few props here because Rob comes and helps us slaughter chickens on the farm. And in a very rudimentary way, we have equipment and we clean out one of our sheds in our barn. We do have a concrete floor now, which is nice. And in about 2 or 2.5 hours, with a group of friends, we're able to butcher chickens and have them for sale to customers from our farm. And Rob is one of the people that has helped us do that. And that is a way of getting food to people that the State Department of Agriculture did not find 5 or 6 years ago was going to work anymore, even though that's how a lot of people still did it. So at that time, we were butchering chickens. Our friend has a farm 5 minutes down the road. He had invested in a USDA inspected facility. It was, brand new, 4 walls. It was, it's a federal regulated and state inspected. That's right, right. So the USDA makes the rules and the state does the inspection. He uses it once a week for about 16 weeks of the year, and the rest of the year it at that time sat empty. So we arranged to raise a certain number of birds. We'd help him with his, he'd help us with ours, and then everybody was happy. At the end of that growing season, an inspector came down our driveway and wanted to know where we were butchering chickens, and he knew because my husband had talked to him at our friend's farm when we were butchering chickens. But Phil, my husband, said, well, we butchered them at our friend's farm. And he said, well, that's not legal because he can't, under the USDA rules, share his facility. He can either do his birds or he can do yours, but he can't do both. And at the time, the legislature had passed an exemption for small farms. If you're selling right from the farm, then you could be exempt from these facilities requirements. And mostly it's a matter of scale. If you're only doing 200 or 300 birds, it doesn't make sense to spend $40,000 for a facility with running water and all those things. So we knew that this exemption had passed, and I showed my Food for Maine's Future saving seeds to the inspector and said, look, it says this exemption passed, so we should be all set. And he didn't know about it. And so he went out to his car and was on the phone for about 2 hours with his supervisor. His boss at the time was Dr. Henrietta Buffet, who was the state veterinarian and has been for a long time in charge of the meat inspection in the state of Maine. And she said, we write the rules for that law. And we intend to write the rules to be equal to the USDA rules. So you're going to have to build the same facility that your friend down the road has. And then a few weeks later, he said, when I was at your farm, he called me on the phone. He said, when I was at your farm, I noticed that you're also selling fresh milk from your farm. And our department is reviewing our policy. When we had started, we'd called the department to make sure that we were doing everything legally. And they said, we don't need to know you as long as you're selling from your farm, as long as you don't advertise. It's legal, and we don't need to come to your farm. We don't need to know you. So we started selling milk, and now 2 years later, the inspector said, actually, we've changed the way we look at that, and we are now defining you as what's called a milk distributor. And in that case, licensing and inspection is required. And again, there would have been, right now we bottle milk out of our home kitchen, and we milked in a barn that didn't at the time have concrete floors everywhere. We've sort of added it slowly as we've gone, and some other things that all added up to quite a lot. So with a combination of the chicken rules changing and the dairy definitions changing, there wasn't going to be any legislative oversight. They just changed the rules within the department that made a very substantial difference in our livelihood. We had been working for 11 years to farm full-time, and it was our first year of having my husband there full-time, and we'd made the leap and didn't feel like at that point we could go back, but stood to lose over half of our income unless we could comply with these rules, which wouldn't have made financial sense or would have meant going into debt to a tune of what wouldn't make sense for what we were actually selling. So at that point, we really did become quite involved, and we went to the legislature and had that public hearing the week of Christmas, and were told they couldn't make the rules any differently, and so they ended up making the rules requiring facilities. So again, it was ironic when you think about definitions, like so much of this as your students and looking into things is to pay attention to weird words and look them up in the dictionary. And I couldn't understand why there was an exemption that had just passed, but it didn't exempt us from anything. There were the requirements just as much for that exemption. And again, there had been everyone in our customer circle and everybody else that we knew that butchered chickens and milked cows, everybody was happy. There weren't any issues about food safety. There weren't issues about quality. to the opposite, everybody was very happy with the quality. Everybody was very happy with the safety. So it wasn't coming from the people. So the question was, where are these changes coming from and why? And then further, in our own community, there was one time when I was coming back from Augusta, and at the time, Ben and Carolyn, who were here, were very small. So they'd stayed at a friend's house in Brooksville, which is a very small town in Hancock County. And I drove back from Augusta to pick them up at this very small town, down lots of winding roads. And I remember thinking, like, how can what happened where I just was affect me being able to sell chicken to my friend, or in this case, barter with them for maple syrup? Like that relationship could change because of what I just witnessed and what just happened. So again, we ask these questions. Who's making these decisions? What kinds of relationships do we want to have in our community? And what rights can we encode into law? Well, about that time, Bob St. Peter was a good friend of ours, and he was at the time the executive director for Food for Maine's Future. And he said, you know, there's this town of Montville that passed an ordinance banning GMOs. So maybe the local level is something to look at. I didn't know anything about local ordinances. But I started learning, and I learned about two towns in western Maine called Shapley and Newfield, who had passed a rights-based ordinance to keep Nestle from putting test drills in their town so they could later extract water. And they hadn't passed a regulatory ordinance that said, we're going to make sure you can only drill this deep, or you can only take X amount of gallons of water from our town and from our aquifers. They said, in our town, we have the right. We make the decisions to determine anything that has to do with our public health, safety, and welfare, which is what it says in Maine's Constitution, and that's a right that towns have. And the people in that town had a right to their water that superseded a corporation's right to come in and take it. So that seemed like a good basis for us to start learning from. So we looked at their ordinances, and we studied their language. And at the same time, this was happening all around the country, the things that were happening at my farm, and we didn't realize initially that there was such a pattern to what was happening. But in the states of Florida and Wyoming, their legislatures were looking at something they called the Food Freedom Act that said any time that food originates in the soil and is being exchanged from one person to another, that's an exchange that should be exempt from licensing and inspection. So we looked at that language and we studied that, and we came up with the Local Food and Community Self-Governance Ordinance. And in 2011, the 5 of us that had worked on it introduced it in the 4 neighboring towns of Penobscot, Blue Hill, Brooksville, and Sedgwick at the same town meeting cycle. And in our area, those all happen in March. And it passed in 3 of the 4 towns, and it passed unanimously. And in my town, in Penobscot, we spend a good deal of time debating things that matter to us. We'd spent 20 minutes debating whether or not we should spend town money to support the local library in Blue Hill. And nobody agreed at the end, and it passed by a fraction. And I was quite nervous about what was going to happen to this food ordinance, because nobody was agreeing on any of these votes. And after the vote on the food ordinance, it was a unanimous vote, and the town applauded itself for having passed the ordinance and standing together to actually take an action that would protect what we valued in our community. So that was the beginning of what was later called the food sovereignty movement. Later that year, it passed in Hope, Maine, which is in Knox County, and later in Trenton, again in Hancock County. That same fall, the Department of Agriculture sued, probably Dan Brown that you've heard about, sued a farmer in Blue Hill for selling milk without a license to his customers. That case would eventually end up at the Maine Supreme Court. But towns continued to pass the ordinance each successive year. So now, 5 years later, 18 towns in Maine have passed the ordinance. 2 towns this year, and a few more are working on it. 3 or 4 more are working on it right now for this year still. I think that's as quick of a romp through the origins that I can make. But I do want to just talk a little bit about what did happen in Augusta when we went. And again, now I've come to look at it as a fantasy civics versus the political reality. And had it not rained, I would have brought an easel, and there would be a sheet here with some nice stick figures that I've grown skilled at drawing with Crayola markers. But essentially what I learned in school and what I thought was the process is that a group of people get together, and if there's an issue that's affecting them, they talk to their state representative. And the state representative puts in a bill, and the bill is heard before a committee, and the committee debates the merits of the bill and decide either to recommend ought to pass, ought not to pass, and then it goes to the floor of the House and is voted on, and then it goes to the floor of the Senate and is voted on, and then the governor can veto it or pass it or sign it, and it becomes a law. That's what I thought was going to happen when I went to Augusta. What happened instead when we went to Augusta, 50 people came for the first hearing, and there was a different influence in the room than I was aware existed, and one was the state agencies. So in this case, it was the Quality Assurance and Regulation Division of the State Department of Agriculture, and they were acting as the experts in the room. They told the legislators what they could and could not do. And that voice had more weight than any number of people in the room had. So that was different. And I later learned the committee would also give the bills to the department to write and make the revisions to, and then it would come back to the committee. And then there were also a whole bunch of people, the women in short skirts for some reason, all in short skirts and high heels, and the men all in suits, that represented different segments of the food lobby, the big food lobby, and pesticides lobbies. And those people had a lot of influence, too, when they spoke to the committee, and more importantly, when they were in the hallway after the hearing, speaking to the committee and influencing how things went. And those voices, fewer in number, were more powerful than the voices of the many more people that were in the room. And then I found out on the raw milk issue, nothing had ever gone through a legislative process. No law had ever been changed. One part of the Department of Agriculture had simply moved from one department to another department. And when they did that, they decided to look at the existing policy. And by simply calling us as farmers a milk distributor, they had vastly changed our access to a livelihood. What we were doing illegal, where previously it had been condoned and encouraged, and it was legal. So that, of course, has been really hard to undo because it all happened within the department, and there wasn't that legislative process. So we found, again, this is kind of fun to draw out with Crayola markers, but if you can picture sort of old style in your imaginations, that this triangle, and on one side of the triangle are some legislators who understand how the process works, but they're not really there to represent the people. Very few in number, but influential, and those I call the obstructionist legislators. They're at the time when we first started, there were just 2 on the committee, one of whom ended up moving to a very important committee called Appropriations, where there were also some political tricks in the bag they could use even after bills that would promote small farms got unanimous votes in the Ag Committee and unanimous votes in the floors of the House and the Senate. Then the obstructionist legislators could still work with the Department of Agriculture and attach fiscal notes and make it look like things were going to cost money that didn't cost money and kill bills. So that was one part of this triangle with these obstructionist legislators. The other part was the agency, in this case, the Department of Agriculture. As we've gone along, first they said no, they were really trying to marginalize what we're doing and saying we're just a really small group of people. This isn't representative of Maine. And then they tried to make us sound like we just really didn't care about the safety or quality of food. And if it wasn't for them, you know, we would have all these dirty practices on our farms. So that was the other part of the triangle. And that worked together very closely with the obstructionist legislator. And the third part of the triangle were the lobbyists. And so I came to see this after the last legislative session as the triangle of doom, because we would have great successes at all of the parts of the process where normal people have access to and are, I would say, still quite democratic. Over time, like the whole Agriculture Committee voted unanimously for the bills that were presented on behalf of small farms and food sovereignty, and also the floors of the House and the Senate. If you get a unanimous vote out of committee, oftentimes that translates into unanimous votes on the floor of the House and the Senate. And even so, there were these political tricks pulled out of the bag that became the political reality that killed a lot of the bills that would put more of a protective layer, or at least acknowledge what people in the communities have done to put a protective layer around ourselves to protect our farming and our food systems. We've also learned, though, along the way, in terms of political reality, we've had to study laws, find laws. And one law that did pass as a direct consequence of the ordinances passing in all these towns was a law that established, that merged the Department of Agriculture with the Department of Conservation and Forestry. And I think Bonnie is going to read some of this because it really is, and I should say first, just as it's not really an aside, but the Local Food and Community Self-Governance Ordinance, what it does in a nutshell is establish a right of community self-governance based on some of the laws we're going to read in our Constitution and in statute, to protect the direct sales of all food that is grown or made from one person to another, whether it's a baked good, whether it's a farm-raised product, or if it's at a Grange supper or a bake sale. So all of that range of just exchange from one person to another food is what we were trying to protect with the ordinance. So those are the two things it does, and the language that Bonnie's about to read stems directly from the ordinance, and it became part of what the legislature directed the Department of Agriculture to do, which will be interesting when you hear people say that you can't do this at the local level.
Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit before I read that law. In the first year that we were passing the ordinances in towns, everybody was saying, well, you really can't do this. Fed trumps state, state trumps local. You can't pass this ordinance. And we said no, because Maine has home rule. And so they can pass ordinances. And people, especially some legislators, would keep insisting, no, you can't. You can't pass this ordinance. And so we just, we were kind of worried about this. And I would say, well, maybe we should change our home rule law before we try to pass the ordinances, and then we can pass the ordinances if we have a stronger home rule law. Well, then we went to Portland for a conference on food law, and the lawyer from Oregon who gave us the terms horizontal policy diffusion and vertical policy integration was there, and he had a really interesting talk, and we thought, oh, this is great. Well, later, we not only had to look at laws, we had to actually read articles in law reviews, and one of the things that I learned from that is that, in fact, you can understand them. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand the law. And this was quite a revelation. And so in one of the articles that he had written, he ended up saying that Maine is one of the 3 states in the country with the strongest home rule laws in the country. I said, oh, all right. So what I'm going to do is tell you what the Maine home rule law is and a little bit about why it's so strong. And then I will read the law that Heather was talking about. So in 1969, the people of Maine voted for home rule in Maine. Before the 60s, it wasn't very common in the country, and there was sort of a rash of people passing usually laws, but in Maine, we put it in the Constitution. That's one of the things that gives us a stronger basis for home rule law. And so that was in 1969. one of the things that the was established then was that the legislature needed to pass laws that supported the home rule acknowledgement in our Constitution. And so this is what they passed. It's called Ordinance Power. It says any municipality, by the adoption, amendment, or repeal of ordinances or bylaws, may exercise any power or function which the legislature has power to confer upon it, which is not denied either expressly or by clear implication, and exercise any power or function granted to the municipality by the Constitution of Maine, general law, or charter. The first piece is called liberal construction. It says this section, being necessary for the welfare of the municipalities and their inhabitants, shall be liberally construed to effect its purposes. That means that unless something is specifically banned, towns are specifically banned from making a law on something, that's the explicit that the first part of this talked about, either expressly or by clear implication. So explicitly, the state can say towns cannot change our laws on this. So think of things that are fairly common, like we couldn't have every town setting their own speed limits. People would go crazy, that sort of thing. We'd still speed, but that's that's a different issue. But there are things that the state does specifically take control of. But under liberal construction, you can do anything else. If your town wants it done, you can pass an ordinance to do it. And there's procedures for that, but it's like, okay, what do you think you need in your town for the safety, health, and well-being of your residents? And you can do that. The second part is presumption of authority. And that says there is a rebuttable presumption that any ordinance enacted under this section is a valid exercise of municipalities' home rule authority. So if you think that your ordinance might be a little too crazy or something, well, that's covered in the first one. You can pass it anyway. The second one says there's a rebuttable presumption of validity. That means that the state has to prove that it's not valid. You don't have to prove that it is. And the state proves that it's not valid when the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, makes a decision regarding the ordinance. In the Dan Brown case, the state Supreme Court explicitly said that they were not going to preempt the ordinance. Ralph Chapman, our representative from the very beginning, had told us that the courts don't like dealing with constitutional issues, which is what we've raised in the ordinance, and so they will do anything to avoid that. And that's what they did. And they did that in the local court and also at the Supreme Court. They came up with a reason. Locally, they said, well, milk isn't food, so it's not covered under the ordinance. So, but that wasn't a scientific definition. It was just the excuse they gave that they didn't have to exempt or preempt the ordinance. And then the Supreme Court had a different excuse. So that's under presumption of authority. Finally, the standard of preemption. The legislature shall not be held to have implicitly denied any power granted to the municipalities under this section unless the municipal ordinance in question would frustrate the purpose of state law. So that other states have passed other requirements that towns would have to meet in order to consider an ordinance valid. Things like one of them is the occupation of the field. If the state in some way, not explicitly in law, but just through general practice, has determined that they're in charge here, that can be used to deny the validity of the ordinance, but not Maine. There are a couple of other things, too, that some states use. But in Maine, if the ordinance does not frustrate the purpose of state law, they won't preempt it, okay? So, in 1979, the Department of Agriculture was established, and a law established it, and part of that law was the legislative intent. And it said the survival of the family farm is of special concern to the people of the state. ability of the family farm to prosper, produce an abundance of high-quality food and fiber, deserves a place of high priority. For this purpose, there is established the Department of Agriculture. By state law, the Department of Agriculture is supposed to support small farms and rural communities.
So again, when we pass this ordinance, it's a real critique. You can't just do anything at the town level. You can't just willy-nilly pass a law just because you don't want to follow rules. But again, if the statute that Bonnie read from the home rule one was as long as you're not frustrating the purpose of state law. So the state, of course, is saying we've made rules and you're frustrating those rules. But what the law says is the purpose of state law. So in 2013, 2 years after this ordinance passed, these two departments were going to merge. And the administration really wanted those departments to merge. And a number of legislators did not for a number of good reasons. And one of those legislators was an organic farmer from Winthrop, Maine named Representative Craig Hickman. And he said, I will not vote for this merger unless the language, he had introduced a bill called the Food Sovereignty Act of 2013 that would have more clearly mandated the state to recognize the authority of towns to regulate food when it is being exchanged between individuals. That didn't pass, so he said, if this merger is going to happen, I want the language of food sovereignty in the language that establishes this new department. And that's what happened. So under anything agricultural is under Title VII in state law. And what it says is that in a section called Local Food and Rural Economic Development, so the state is recognizing that agriculture has a lot to do with rural economic development, strong, financially healthy communities. It is the policy of the state to encourage food self-sufficiency for its citizens. The department shall support policies that, okay, now there are 5 different things. The department shall support policies that, through local control, preserve the ability of communities to produce, process, sell, purchase, and consume locally produced food. They must support these policies. It's hard to understand our local food ordinance not fitting into that item. Small-scale farming and food production that ensure the preservation of family farms and traditional foodways. This is the first time I'm aware of, anyways, that foodways has been defined in statute, and the state of Maine did that. So the department is supposed to support policies that ensure the preservation of family farms and traditional foodways through small-scale farming and food production. They are mandated to support policies that improve the health and well-being of citizens of the state by reducing hunger and increasing food security through improved access to wholesome, nutritious foods by supporting family farms and encouraging sustainable farming and fishing. Okay, so the Department of Agriculture for the last 3 years is supposed to be doing all it can to support ecological farming so more people have access to farm-raised food. They will do this if we hold them to this. There is no exact thing that they're supposed to do or that they have to do, but they are supposed to be supporting this. Also, self-reliance and personal responsibility. The department shall promote self-reliance and personal responsibility by ensuring the ability of individuals, families, and other entities to prepare, process, advertise, and sell foods directly to customers intended solely for consumption by the customers or their families, and to enhance the rural economic development and environmental and social wealth of the communities. And that social wealth is another very big term to have added to state statute, because it acknowledges it isn't just about money, but there's a lot of social wealth created when people exchange food at farms. So at my farm, what happens an awful lot in our farm store is that different people show up at the same time, and maybe this young mother needs help with childcare, and this older grandmother would love to have a small baby in her home again. All sorts of family relations and good things that happen because of that. I think we've talked about why the state level isn't the most effective level to start from. It certainly has, the more of these ordinances that pass, the more legislators in towns all over the state are putting forward supportive legislation. So there has been a natural ripple effect, but I think it's still stronger at the bottom. And I think we also wanted to just give you a how-to on how to do this at the local level, but maybe we should go to questions, and maybe that'll come out in the questions, because I saw you two both raised your hand. So he wanted to know, given that that's what the statute already says that the Department of Agriculture should be doing, is anybody holding them to account and saying, what are you doing to make sure that this is happening? The short answer is yes. When there have been other laws being presented, Senator Langley out our way too in Western Hancock County cited this law. We continue to cite the law in testimony, but making them do something is a different issue. And another law that passed last year was one that was called an Act to Increase Food Self-Sufficiency, and part of it was that the department should come up with a promotional campaign very similar to what we had after World War II. All these kind of posters. Also to establish a labor pool of, you may be aware, Governor LePage has mandated that anybody who's on any kind of public assistance should be either volunteering or looking for a job. So this bill established a labor pool of people that could be working on farms, and to link farms with a labor pool of unemployed people. So there are ways that legislators have, and that again was a bill by Craig Hickman, and there are ways that they're trying to get them to do that. And part of that too is also the difference between rule making and law making. And again, so if people in their communities, and in all of these communities, it isn't just farmers that are trying to pass this ordinance. It's largely people that may or may not even shop at farms, but they understand the threat to democracy and the threat to our food system. And so again, they've said, we've all said we can enact these laws. And we have taken ourselves out of the position of being in the defensive position, waiting, and into a proactive position of enacting law ourselves. So the question is, how did we make our voices heard by others in our community? So the first thing we did was I wrote a letter to our customers, and Bob at Food for Maine's Future really amplified that letter by putting it out through channels that are still mysterious to me, but that got a lot of support and awareness for the issue. And then we used we talked to people. I mean, the farm, and in a lot of these towns where it's passed, people have been talking about it in general stores, or at the hair salon, or at a construction company in Blue Hill. And in my case, it was at our farm store. I could let people know what was happening. And of course, people at our farm store were very concerned and wanted to be active in supporting. We wrote letters to the editor. The local newspaper in our community was very supportive, coming to cover the story. We talked to our select boards. And in my town in Penobscot, the chairman of the select board was the last dairy farmer to ship milk in Hancock County. So he understood these issues very, very personally. And he gave us the venue at the town hall and was supportive in letting our voices be heard. But it was through a number of different sources, but really just talking about it and using the newspapers and that sort of thing. All right. Well, I thank you all for coming. I'm really, really happy to see so many people here on